Imagine being a father of 7 facing the unimaginable loss of your child, only to be accused of causing their death. And what if the confession used against you wasn't genuine at all? It's September 2008 in Troy, New York. Adrian P. Thomas, a 26-year-old unemployed father of 7, is living what many would consider a challenging life. On September 23rd, his 4-month-old son, Matthew, is pronounced brain dead at a hospital in Troy, later dying at Albany Medical Center Hospital. The initial medical report indicates that Matthew suffered from head trauma, leading the police to suspect foul play. The authorities believe that an adult must be responsible for Matthew's condition, and their focus narrows on the parents, particularly Adrian Thomas. The tragedy of losing an infant son is compounded by the police investigation that follows. As the investigation unfolds, Thomas is arrested and charged with second-degree murder. This charge sets off a series of legal proceedings that would eventually lead to 2 significant trials, multiple appeals, and widespread controversy. The interrogation of Adrian P. Thomas began under stressful and traumatic circumstances. On the day of the incident, police removed Thomas's other children from his home, placing them in Child Protective Services. Thomas was taken to the police station for questioning, and after about 2 hours, he expressed thoughts of self-harm, so he was taken to a hospital for evaluation. 15 hours later, he was returned to the police station and the interrogation resumed. By the time the second portion of the interrogation began, Matthew had died. However, the detectives didn't inform Thomas. Instead, they told him Matthew was still alive and the only way to save him was to confess. Thomas mentioned that he had accidentally dropped Matthew a few inches into his crib days earlier. But a detective, leveraging his experience with head injuries in the military, accused him of lying. He said the injuries were similar to those from a high-speed car crash, pressuring Thomas to admit to a more severe act. Other detectives continued to suggest possible scenarios. They proposed that Thomas, feeling depressed, emotionally overwhelmed, and frustrated after being berated by his wife for his chronic unemployment, might have acted out of frustration and thrown the child onto the mattress. Under this relentless pressure and the psychologically manipulative tactics, Thomas eventually reenacted what police said happened. Using a clipboard, he demonstrated how he supposedly hurled Matthew onto the bed. The first trial of Adrian Thomas began in October 2009, a year after the tragic death of his son Matthew. Central to the prosecution's case was the nearly 10-hour-long videotaped interrogation where Thomas, after hours of intense questioning, confessed to throwing his son onto the bed 3 times. The jury watched as Thomas demonstrated how he allegedly threw Matthew, with the police officers pressing him to explain his actions. The prosecution argued that this was a clear admission of guilt. However, the defense painted a different picture. On the stand, Thomas recanted his confession, stating that he had lied during the interrogation due to overwhelming pressure and his desperate need to end the questioning. "Did your son ever hit his head on a crib rail?" asked the defense attorney. "No," Thomas said. "Did you hit him in the head with your head when you were lying on the bed? Did you throw him down hard on the bed 3 times? "No," Thomas answered. "Why did you tell police you did those things?" "Because they kept saying that I did, and I just wanted the interview to be over so I could go to the hospital and see my son and wife." Expert testimonies played a crucial role in the trial. Professor Richard Offshee, an expert on false confessions, reviewed the taped confession and testified that it fits his model of false confessions. However, the prosecution countered with their own professor, Paul Cassell, who argued that there was little empirical evidence to support Offshee's theory. The judge ultimately sided with the prosecution, denying the defense's request to call Offshee to testify before the jury. Despite the defense's efforts to discredit the confession, the jury found Thomas guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison, marking the end of the first trial, but not the end of Thomas's legal battles. Following his conviction, Thomas's legal team mounted an appeal, focusing on the coercive nature of the interrogation. In 2012, the state of New York denied his appeal, concluding that Thomas had not been physically restrained, threatened, or mistreated during the interrogation. However, in 2014, the New York Court of Appeals unanimously ruled that the interrogation had indeed gone too far. The judges determined that the techniques used undermined Thomas's right to not incriminate himself. As a result, they ordered a new trial, excluding the videotaped confession from evidence. See, police used what's called the Reid Technique when trying to get a confession from Thomas. Developed in the 1950s by John E. Reid, this method has been widely adopted by law enforcement across the United States. Its goal is to extract confessions through a structured 9-step process, which involves a mix of psychological strategies and confrontational tactics. Step 1. Positive confrontation. The interrogation begins with a direct accusation. The investigator tells the suspect that the evidence clearly indicates their involvement in the crime. In Thomas's case, police confronted him with the assertion that he was responsible for his son's injuries. Step 2. Shift blame. The interrogator then offers a moral justification or excuse for the crime, suggesting reasons that might make the suspect feel less guilty about their actions. For Thomas, this might have involved suggesting that the injuries were accidental or a result of frustration. Step 3. Minimize denials. This technique aims to discourage the suspect from denying their involvement. Each time Thomas tried to deny harming his son, the interrogators would steer the conversation back to their theme, reinforcing the notion of his guilt. Step 4. Using denials. If the suspect offers reasons why they couldn't have committed the crime, the interrogator uses these objections to further entrench the theme of guilt. For example, if Thomas claimed he was too loving to cause such harm, this would be turned around to suggest that everyone has a bad day sometimes. Step 5. Reinforce sincerity. By maintaining eye contact and using body language that suggests empathy, the interrogator tries to keep the suspect engaged and receptive. Step 6. Offer alternatives. At this point, the suspect often becomes quiet and more withdrawn. The interrogator then shifts to discussing alternative ways the suspect could commit the crime. And if they cry, tell them that they're guilty. And by the way, yes, this is a real technique used by the police. Step 7. Alternative question. The suspect is presented with 2 scenarios, both implying guilt but with different moral weights. For instance, Thomas might have been asked whether he deliberately hurt his son out of frustration or if it was an unintended consequence of a momentary lapse. Either choice implies guilt. Step 8. Admit guilt. Once the suspect begins to confess, they are encouraged to provide a detailed account of the incident, reinforcing the admission of guilt. Thomas's demonstration of throwing his son onto the bed would fit into this step, as he physically reenacted the alleged crime. Step 9. Document admission. This is done with audio, video, or written. In this case, Thomas's entire 10-hour interrogation was recorded on video. Critics of the Reid technique argue that its confrontational and psychologically manipulative methods can lead to false confessions, especially among vulnerable individuals. The technique's reliance on creating a high-pressure environment and its potential for leading suspects to admit to crimes they didn't commit were key issues highlighted by his defense during the appeals and subsequent legal battles. The second trial of Adrian Thomas began on May 27, 2014, following the landmark decision by the New York Court of Appeals to exclude his videotaped confession. With that confession deemed inadmissible, the focus of the second trial shifted to the medical evidence surrounding Matthew Thomas's death. The prosecution had a medical examiner testify that Matthew had subdural hematomas, which he suggested were caused by head injuries resulting from violent shaking. The defense, however, led by attorney Steve Coffey, presented a different narrative. Their medical examiner testified that Matthew died of septic shock due to a bacterial infection. He argued that the symptoms of brain swelling and subdermal hematomas could have been caused by natural medical conditions rather than trauma. Additionally, child abuse expert Dr. Barnes examined CT scans and concluded that the brain injuries were old and possibly occurred at birth. He noted that Matthew was born prematurely and was a twin, factors that could increase the risk of bleeding in the brain. In the closing arguments, the district attorney argued that Thomas had bounced Matthew on the bed until he fell and sustained fatal head trauma. In contrast, Coffey questioned the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses and pointed out the absence of key medical personnel, such as Dr. Edge and neuroradiologist Dr. Hoover, who treated Matthew at the hospital but did not testify, suggesting the prosecution didn't like what they had to say. After approximately 7 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on June 12, 2014. Thomas's defense team and family were relieved and overjoyed by the outcome. Thomas himself was reportedly stunned by the verdict, having endured years of legal battles and imprisonment. The case of Adrian P. Thomas underscores the profound implications of coerced interrogation techniques on the justice system. The Reid Technique, while designed to elicit confessions, often exerts intense psychological pressure on suspects. In Thomas's case, the nearly 10-hour-long interrogation exemplified how extreme duress can compel individuals to make false confessions just to escape the immediate torment of questioning. After all, in America, over a quarter of the 311 people exonerated through DNA testing had given a false confession. Calls for reform are growing louder, advocating for interrogation methods that prioritize truth-finding over confession extraction. Models like the Peace method used in Britain and Canada offer alternatives that emphasize information gathering without the use of psychological coercion. The Adrian P. Thomas case stands as a poignant reminder of the need for vigilance and reform in interrogation practices to prevent future injustices and uphold the integrity of our justice system. Thanks for joining me on this harrowing journey. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your comments below. Thanks for watching, everyone. I will see you next time.